right? And so, as we're looking back and looking forward, there's a lot of singing in the 60s, yes? And I think now is a moment where people are starting again to see, I know Paola's coming as we've been helping with the Women's Choir and other efforts that are starting to build up our repertoires again, to be out there and grounding us in connecting our culture to these movements. And so in this looking backward and looking forward, we're going to start with a song that was actually used in 1968 during the Poor People's Campaign. It was written by Reverend Dr. Frederick Douglass Kirkpatrick and Jimmy Colliers. It was a song that was sung at Resurrection City, so it's putting ourselves in that place on the National Mall, in the soul tent that was there, where they would daily share music and share stories and share cultures. And it has a little bit of a, we'll add in a little bit of a modern flair as well, but I'm going to teach it, and then you're all going to sing it with me. That's the spirit of this, yes? So if everyone has heard the song, Everybody's Got a Right to Live, I think it's pretty appropriate in this moment, too, that's really what's at stake right now. These movements that we're coming to are about people's lives, and people's lives being at stake. And so we're claiming that tonight, that we all have a right to live in this society. So it sounds like this. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. 'Cause everybody's got a right to live. Now, we all go down to jail because it was about a civil disobedience movement at that moment. They were going down to Washington to claim we're not leaving until these things change. So that's where today we are singing that again. In the middle, if you're not so ready to sing, there's also going to be a little bit of call and response chant. So I'm just going to prep you for that real quick and then we'll try it out. So when I break, we're going to say, everybody's got a right to live. You can respond, to live. So try that. Everybody's got a right to live. To live. Everybody's got a right to dream. To dream. Everybody's got a right to love. To love. Everybody's got a right to learn. To learn. You'll get it. We'll go through that a few times too. But now I need y'all to stand up with me because that's how this works. Yeah. All right. So I'm gonna start it, and you can join in. Here we go. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. 'Cause everybody's got a right to live. Try that again. Here we go. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. 'Cause everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to dream. Everybody's got a right to love. Everybody's got a right to learn. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to dream. Everybody's got a right to love. Everybody's got a right to. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. Everybody's got a right to live. One more. Here, let's go. Everybody's got a right to live. Everybody's got a right to live. And before this campaign fails, we'll all go down to jail. 'Cause everybody's got a right to live. You feel good now?
If anybody had doubt what art can do, we just felt it. Thank you so much, Sharon. I'm very pleased to be here today with two amazing women, Johanna Fernández and Charon Hribar. Thank you for all the work you're doing. Just to start the conversation, I wanted to know, for example, with Johanna, because history is as important as art when we do our work. And I wanted to know what were the issues in the 60s that were the most prominent that we can still be linked to, and things that that were happening in that time.
Oh, right, there's a microphone. I want to start by reading a quote which I usually read in my classes, and I ask my students who might have said these words. And this is what was said in a speech. We must honestly face the fact that the movement must address itself to the question of restructuring the whole of American society. There are 40 million poor people here, and one day we must ask the question, why are there 40 million poor people in America? And when you begin to ask that question, you are raising questions about the economic system, about a broader distribution of wealth. You see, my friends, when you deal with this, you begin to ask the question, who owns the oil? You begin to ask the question, who owns the iron ore? You begin to ask the question, why is it that people have to pay water bills in a world that is 2/3 water? When I say question the whole society, it means ultimately coming to see that the problem of racism, the problem of economic exploitation, and the problem of war are all tied together. So who do you imagine said those words? If you know it, don't say, but who do those words sound like? Huh? They sound like Martin Luther King Jr., perhaps, if you know the broad history of his life. But most students think that these were words uttered by some more radical, quote unquote, like Malcolm X. So they usually say this is something that Malcolm X said, not Martin Luther King. So I wanted to start by painting a picture of 1968 and its significance, like what was so important about 1968. It was definitely the pinnacle in terms of consciousness and radicalization of an epoch that really began during World War II, a struggle for civil rights, equal rights, and economic rights. The issue that really transformed the consciousness of the nation, of people of all races, was the Vietnam War. Early in the year 1968, the Vietnamese launched the Tet Offensive. It was a military campaign that attacked the cities. This was important because the media was able to film the war and the fighting. Previously, the war had happened in the jungle. And this was a surprise attack launched by the National Liberation Front of the Vietnamese against the Americans, when the Americans believed that, as had been the case for the last 20 years of war, during the Vietnamese New Year, the Vietnamese would be partying. They would not fight, because that had been the case during the war. And so this surprise attack was very symbolic, captured in the media for the world to see really the barbarity of war. And Americans were told by our president that we were about to win, but it seemed that the Vietnamese were very powerful. So the war really exposed the contradictions of our government, the barbarity of war. It showed what the United States was willing to do to win. There were many people who died. You probably know that the statistics of American casualties are at 50,000, more or less. So the war came home. And this was the first working class war. So there was a growing consciousness that the poor and working class people in this country were fighting, and not the wealthy. But mostly the Vietnamese who were termed by our president, President Johnson, a raggedy-ass little third-rate nation. That's what he called the Vietnamese. Appeared to be quite courageous, and it seemed that they were going to win. So the struggle of the Vietnamese, in fact, inspired people fighting against colonial rule and imperialism around the world and domestically. It inspired Chicanos and African Americans and Asians and poor whites to fight, and to fight in a militant way. So the war really brought home the contradictions of the system, not unlike what happened in the United States immediately after the Iraq War. So initially, everyone supported the war in Iraq, right? And in Afghanistan. A year or two later, government policies began to be questioned, and soldiers came back to talk about the war. And so consciousness shifted in the United States. This happened to a much greater extent here in the 60s, in part because it was such a massive war, and ultimately because American empire was being challenged, right, by this very small third world nation that very few people understood. The other issue that the war really exposed was that we were willing to send working class men and women and African Americans disproportionately at the beginning of the war to fight in Vietnam, but we were not willing to invest the same resources on issues of poverty. So by 1968, war expenditure and imperial overstretch was creating a crisis domestically. The government couldn't make ends meet, and it began to cut the budget of the war on poverty and on welfare program, Medicaid, and even the budgets of hospitals like Metropolitan Hospital, not far from here. So activists began to expose the fact that the United States was willing to fight for democracy and equality abroad, but not at home. And so the war really, and I could talk about the other issues, but the war radicalized a generation, and it helped Americans make the connection between international crises and international politics and domestic struggles. So this was a moment that really brought home, because of the high level of political discussion in so many different circles in the United States, the importance of solidarity. That people fighting for justice here, that people fighting against racism and for economic inequality could affect the lives of people fighting against imperial rule in Vietnam. That requires a very high level of political understanding. And that was something that in the movements was accepted knowledge, that a victory for one is a victory for all. An injury to one is an injury to all. And that's something that we need to learn in this period. When we have Black Lives Matter, attacks on immigrants, a situation among poor whites that's creating disasters like the ones we saw in Florida. Although that situation really didn't affect a poor white community, actually affected a middle-class white community. So there was a sense that that class and racism and war were all of the same cloth, came from the same system. And so in this period, we see the emergence of the Rainbow Coalition, which we associate with Jesse Jackson, but as you might know, the Rainbow Coalition was launched by the Black Panther Party in Chicago, and it was a coalition that included Puerto Ricans in the Young Lords and Mexicans who were in this radical organization, African Americans in the Black Panther Party, and poor whites from Appalachia who called themselves the Young Patriots. So there was a sense that we needed to fight together if we were going to overthrow the root causes of inequality.
Excellent. Thank you for that excellent intro. And I wanted to ask you, Charon, about one specific project, the one you're doing now, but coming from the 60s. Do you want to
Sure.
let us know what happened back then and what's happening now with the project?
Yeah, I really appreciated the history layout that you were starting with, and actually the quote that you used from Dr. King is actually one that we use often in our work. I'm part of a large group of folks, a movement right now that is trying to re-invoke the original Poor People's Campaign, and we've been drawing on that history, and for a number of years, some of the folks that are part of the network that I've worked with come out of the Black Panthers and come out of the projects of survival of that time, and the efforts to really bring people together across issues, across race, across geography, and really seeing what it might look like now in this moment to build a Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival in this moment where, we are seeing movements arise to respond, and how do we take a lesson from history of really seeing the need to be able to come together and build the kind of power that is needed to be able to shift. I think King also has a quote that says, how do we actually build a organization, a structure big enough to make the government say yes when it wants to say no, that we're not in our kind of isolated lanes, I think, which in some ways after that moment, because of various impacts, because of the war, because of, things, I think at that moment it was kind of a climax of some of that work, and people continued to do it. But in that kind of way, as not only King was assassinated, as Fred Hampton was assassinated, all of these things of people kind of grounding themselves in the work they were doing, but where was the kind of major energy that was bringing those things together? And we're seeing at this moment that there is a possibility that people across movements are trying to be able to reach out and think about how do we actually start to organize together. And with this Poor People's Campaign we've really taken up those three evils that Dr. King was addressing, of looking at, the systemic racism, of poverty, of the militarism that's here, both in the U.S. and abroad. And we've also really taken up the issue of ecological devastation as well, seeing as we've gone around the country, we've done a lot of work trying to connect different grassroots communities that have been organizing, whether it be folks in Aberdeen, Washington, who are organizing in poor white communities, dealing with, really high levels of unemployment among the youth, and high issues of like heroin in their communities, to folks in the Gulf Coast that are fighting back the pipelines, to folks that are fighting against the issues of public schools that continue to deteriorate, of really, as we go around and have been organizing with these communities, also just seeing like how one's issues might look different, but they're actually, there's real connections there, and adding to that this question of the ecology, as we've seen, whether it be issues of people experiencing asthma in large cities, to coal ash issues in places like Western North Carolina, to people's water being shut off in Flint, in Flint and Detroit, we had to add that piece in as well, of seeing like the role of the environment as being a major issue, but. What I would say in terms of, that period of 68 and how we've learned lessons from now, I think, we also saw what it looked like to move from a reform movement to a revolutionary movement leading through the 60s into 68, and really needing to ask, it's not just kind of the small winnable goals that we need, but how do we really look at these structural issues in this major way, and being able to shape, to change how we're even thinking about what's possible. And so right now, needing to be able to think about, a kind of demand that is, and I think why we're calling for this this language that picks up from King, a revolution of values, that he put out, of needing to say, when we talk about poverty, most often it's, we can continue charity or we continue grants or for programming. But we have the means in the society to completely end poverty, right? It's not that we don't have those means. We were just doing a big event in Memphis last Monday with the Fight for 15 workers who have been, organizing. And one of the women said, all the time, we have 1% that owns 40% of the wealth in this country. No one asks why. But when we organize for fast food workers to make $15 an hour, people lash out at us asking, why should we be fighting for this? Like, who are you to ask for $15 an hour? And that contradiction, like, how do we hold that contradiction in this moment of recognizing that the means are at hand, but do we actually, what are we doing to create a will in this country to actually take that lead and actually do something about it?
Yes, yeah. Those questions seems to be happening for a long time, I have to say. And coming here as an immigrant, I was surprised by many things I didn't know happen in this country. So I wonder, what is the role of history for you in terms of this kind of maybe a second wave of Rainbow Coalition kind of aspiration, where so many people are working together and organizing again and very strongly? How can we work with history? How can we use it as a tool for the work we're doing today?
I think that history is important because ideologically, over the last 30 years, Americans have been fed a pretty regressive, backward bunch of analysis of why the world looks the way it does for them. So most Americans in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s believed that the major problem in American society was crime, even though the rate of crime pretty much stayed the same throughout that period. There were peaks, but you probably know the statistic that the rate of crime in all of US history has more or less remained the same. In the 80s and 90s, in the public imagination, the problem with society was immigrants. So all public policy of the 80s and 90s revolved around immigration legislation, anti-immigrant legislation, and law and order. That was pretty, and welfare reform. and welfare reform. That is what most Americans, if you ask them, saw as a problem in society. But what was happening beneath the surface was that a massive transfer of wealth from the bottom of society and the working class to the top was happening. All Americans, working class Americans, middle class Americans, were seeing their wages decline exponentially. Their jobs were leaving the country, but they were too busy kicking down to realize that the problem was really much more structural. So what history helps us see is that, for example, one of the major issues of the 60s was automation and deindustrialization of American cities, which began during World War II, contrary to popular belief. So this is a conversation that has gripped American society today, that white Americans, working class white Americans, are the victims of deindustrialization and the out-migration of jobs and industries to the South and abroad. But that process hit African Americans, Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, and Native Americans who were for the first time migrating to the cities in large numbers after World War II. That's when deindustrialization began. At a moment that people of color are moving to the cities, white people are moving to the suburbs, and the structural economic problem is being produced that for the first time in the history of the city produces permanent unemployment. That category had never existed in history, not of the United States, human history, because cities usually produce jobs. But now for the first time, permanent unemployment was a category that was being studied by the government because of the movement of industries to the south and then abroad. But the problems were categorized in racial terms. It wasn't an economic problem in the mouths of politicians and the media. The problem was that people of color destroyed the city because of their culture, because of other issues. But when you study history, you actually realize you actually have to confront the issue of deindustrialization that then broadened to working class white communities in the 1970s and 80s. I want to talk some more about the other issues because they're important, in part because they're still here today. One of the major issues of the 60s that the Black Panthers and the Young Lords and other activists addressed was issues of medical discrimination and healthcare. So we tend to think of the 60s as a decade that really addressed issues of women's rights and civil rights and the war. But if we look deep down at the campaigns launched addressed issues of economic import. So you probably know that the Black Panthers and the Young Lords, they launched community campaigns that address issues of tuberculosis, the spread of tuberculosis in communities. The Young Lords are responsible for lead poisoning legislation in New York, passed in the early 70s because they launched the campaign against lead poisoning and its impact on children. They occupied Lincoln Hospital to dramatize the horrific conditions of health under which people of color were being treated or not. Issues of public health were critical. Sanitation was an issue that both of these organizations addressed. The issue of garbage here in New York was epic, and it was worse in communities of color, so the Young Lords actually organized a series of garbage dumping campaigns that got public attention, and that led the mayor to really restructure how garbage was collected in New York. So that's why we now have opposite side of the street parking. It was part of the strategy deployed by the city to address the problem once people of color started protesting and saying the reason why garbage is not being collected in East Harlem is because you perceive us as garbage. And that was something, that campaign benefited all of New Yorkers, right? It actually forced the government to address public need. So looking at these campaigns and this history really gives you a sense of the complexity of social struggle. And it also helps to illustrate that the issue of racism and discrimination against African Americans in particular are the major contradiction, has historically been the major contradiction in American society and the narrative of American freedom. And so every time African Americans have fought, what the United States perceives as freedom has been extended to all. So the struggle around the rights of African Americans, the civil rights movement that began during World War II, was picked up by women in the movement, and the women's movement emerges. and Puerto Ricans and Mexicans and Asians form their own organizations, and poor whites. So this is something that one of the speakers previously here talks about in his work, Eric Foner, that the fight for the freedom of Black Americans is a fight about the issue of democracy of all Americans. And so the study of history is important in part because it helps us understand why we have to defend the Black Lives Matter movement, which is now being demonized as a terrorist organization or movement, right? This is the same strategy that was used in the 60s against the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the organization organized by Martin Luther King, but also SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and the Black Panthers and the Young Lords. So the government, through the counterintelligence program of the FBI, in collaboration with the police, identified Black activists and Black radicals as terrorists. Literally, that term was used in the New York Times. And so what we see then is a demonization of Black activism and Black radicals to undercut the legitimacy of their struggles. And we see the same process with the same language happening right now. And I don't know if you guys heard that this FBI study is out that names the Black Lives Matter movement as a threat to national security. But that movement, much like the Occupy Wall Street movement and the movement to preserve the rights of immigrants in this country, is also raising a question that affects us all about the root causes of economic inequality in the country. And there are two possibilities, right? One possibility blames people of color, and that's one that has been used historically. And so we have the rise of white supremacy that comes home to roost, right, as we saw happening in Florida. But there's another possibility, and the other possibility is that we build a movement that explains the world to white Americans and really educates the public about the fact that the 1% have much more to do with the miseries of Americans than Black people or Mexicans or other people of color, or prisoners for that matter, or welfare moms.
Wow, I just want you guys to keep talking. So good. But thank you for that. I was thinking that all of that intensity that people have to live, sometimes are relieved to a general public through art. And all of these wars also entail an imaginary war, a war against the imaginary as well, and how you create radical imaginaries. And there I want to ask you kind of the same question, but in terms of art. How do you think art can be locating itself in all these struggles in a way that really empower the issues that are being addressed? And
So I'm going to kind of tie the history piece and the art piece a little bit together, because I think that knowing our history and knowing what's taken place is really important for thinking about social change and how people imagine social change happens. I think, also knowing, what the issues are and why we're facing those. But in terms of, if we think back to movements, I think, how these movements now are getting demonized. And throughout, every movement, I think there is art that has captured what was happening and being able to teach us the history of those moments, and thinking about really creative ways that it was able to draw attention to what was happening. You mentioned the Occupy movement, and I think that there were, several Occupies that happened before this most recent Occupy. There was the bonus army that occupied the National Mall back during the Great Depression, and they really used that space and created a visual, contradiction of what was happening of veterans coming back from the war and not getting the bonuses that they were, supposed to be getting, and going and uniting on the National Mall and using, they had like these big caskets, and they called it the tombstone bonus because they wouldn't be able to actually get that money until after they died. And being able to, come together in that kind of way and visualize like that occupation was actually, as well as the Poor People's Campaign then took that up again in the 60s of creating this whole, what they called Resurrection City on that National Mall. And while it was an organizing tactic, it was also, I think, in some ways, this visualization and using kind of how do we capture the imagination of saying, we're going to bring all of these folks to Washington and make people recognize what's happening. And they actually built these A-frame structures, and on them people would actually write messages and create art. And they had something called the hunger wall, tell it like it is, in the space. And while the media was really talking about criminalizing Resurrection City and really demonizing the people that were there, I think you see this over and over again of like how the mainstream is depicting our movements and actually what's happening. What was happening in Resurrection City were people actually sharing stories, sharing music, creating art together. That was something that was really bringing people in that space together. And it was something, I think, through, as we think about the way, the songs are used too, right? They're able to break through and touch people's imagination and hearts in a way that often, especially the way the media is able to like demonize our movements, that I think is really important, to be able to put out our images, to be able to put out our messages, and how that we have to think really strategically about that. I just came back from Raleigh, North Carolina, where we had over 100 artists come together from 33 states in Washington, D.C., that as we're gearing up to do 40 days of direct action in the spring, starting on Mother's Day for the Poor People's Campaign, we were really intentional of thinking of, like, how are we going to fight back against what we already could see, like, how are people going to be talking about this campaign? We need to have a way to put it out visually, like, what is the message we're going to be putting out? What is the message that we're going to be putting out through songs, so that even if, there's a piece that the media is going to put out, we're able to combat it with some of these other places and really penetrate, people's hearts and minds in teaching this work through the arts and culture of the movement.
Well, great. We only have 5 minutes, so I have like 7 other questions, but I will have maybe a conclusive one, which is, what can we do moving forward?
Well, I think we need to build a culture of resistance, for sure. And as you were speaking, I was thinking that visually, artists help challenge dominant ideology and what people accept as natural. Okay. And they do it very quickly with a slogan, with a photograph. So one of the very important elements of the 60s was that people at the bottom of society were humanized. And so the slogan, "I am a man," and that photograph had a profound impact psychologically on the nation. Welfare was extended to people of color, and women of color in particular, during this period. And part of what Women on Welfare did, beginning in 1968, when the rolls were being cut because of the war, was that they started protesting and they started telling their stories, which humanized them and challenged the dominant idea of Black and Latino women on welfare as promiscuous women who tended to cheat the rolls. So that notion of welfare women as cheats, promiscuous, no good people emerged in the 60s to demonize the activism of this population. So part of what we need is an ideological strategy to counteract the dominant ideas of society that Mexicans are bad hombres, that we need to make America great again, which is a racist slogan, that the problem with society are prisoners or welfare people. We need slogans and art and literature that teach people very quickly that the problem with society is economic, and that we would gain more from solidarity on the basis of class than the divisions that the people on top of society have foisted or have put out. And I'm not just talking about the Trumps of the world, but the legislation and the demonization of immigrants and prisoners and law and order, that ideology was supported by Democrats and Republicans alike. And now the chickens are really coming home to roost for everybody.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think it's part of like how do we change the narrative, and I think using the arts and culture is a really strong way to do that, and to be able to, I think at this moment when it is so divisive in our country, like to really be able to see like how we're all being impacted right now for the majority of folks by these various issues, and that we have more at stake to come together than to actually continue on this trend of fighting one another. And so, I think ways of doing that, I do think telling stories is really important. I know in any action that we're doing, we've been really trying to have different, like a variety of people getting up and talking about how these different issues are impacting them. Because in every story, we're able to connect, right? If you tell me your story, then I'm able to see something in that story that I can connect with, and I think that that's really powerful. Like we often, can start on statistics and like these are our issues, but like there's something core in that, in being able to identify with one another as human beings and humanizing one another. You can't just shut someone out once they kind of put that out there. If we are able to be vulnerable and see like how we can connect, I think that's really powerful. And it is, I think we do need to be able to connect. We do need to build the kind of relationships that can take us forward, and to build a movement that is for all of us, because that's really what is necessary in this moment, for change to happen. It's not going to happen just, by one group or one person. We need all of us right now.
Thank you so much for this presentation. And definitely, as you say, art is the one space where we can defend complexity in the human way. So thank you so much, and see you guys the next one.